So again, I do apologize for this sound in the background, but let's continue. I hope I'm still audible enough. So we're going to take it in steps and discuss what's going to happen because of one impulse that is started or initiated by the SA node. So the first one that we're going to talk about is what is happening in okay what is happening because of the SA node activity. So the SA node is going to fire an impulse, and this impulse will go through the atrium. And from the atrium, we find that now we're going to have contraction, because after the impulse or after depolarization, we're supposed to have a mechanical response that is contraction. But before we go on, I want to review the pressures again. So at rest, we have about 8 millimeters of mercury in the atrium. So we're looking at the left side of the heart, and about 0 in the ventricle. Then in the aorta, we have another valve that is here. This valve is also unidirectional in that it opens up to let blood flow from the ventricle to the aorta. So it's forward flowing. So this is known as the mitral valve, and that is known as the aortic valve with an O here. All right. So in the aorta, the resting pressure is at 80 millimeters of mercury. So this is before the impulse and the contraction start. So let's take it step by step. The first thing that we're going to see is atrial contraction. So we're going to call this atrial contraction phase. What is going to happen? So what we're going to do is we're going to see what's going to happen in the atrium, what's going to happen in the ventricle, and what's going to happen in the aorta. We're going to appreciate those things. So the first thing that will happen when this part starts contracting, okay, due to the impulse, of course, because it's contracting, it's going to produce a pressure wave within the atrium, a small wave, because there's increase in pressure. Okay, so it's at 8, yes, but there'll be a slight increase in pressure because it is now contracting. So we're going to have it at 8, and then there will be a slight bump, and this bump is known as the A wave. All right. So the A wave will be noted at this point within the atrium. What is happening between the atrium and the ventricle? So because we have increased pressure compared to the ventricular pressure, we find that the mitral valve at this point is open. All right. So the mitral valve is open. We go back to the principles that we just learned. So because the mitral valve is open, we're going to see that the blood, okay, in this case, that is in the atrium is going to flow into the ventricle. Okay, so there will be atrial flow into the ventricle. Now, the ventricle at this point, so whilst the atrium is pumping blood into the ventricle, we find that now the ventricle will have the blood that was coming from the atria translated into it. So the volume of the blood in the ventricle at this point, okay, the volume of the blood in the ventricle at this point is known as end diastolic volume. We'll get back to this soon, so keep that in mind, end diastolic volume. All right. So that is what is happening in the first phase. In the second phase, we have what is now known as isovolumetric ventricular contraction. All right, so what is happening here? So now the impulse has reached the AV node and is now being translated into the ventricular area. So what we see is, as the wave of depolarization is getting to the ventricle, as the ventricles begin to contract. So at the onset of contraction, remember, it is coming from this resting component where it has just blood flowing into it because of the activity of the atrium. So from this pressure, it is now increasing. But what do we have here? What we have here is, number one, before I go on what we have here, note that because the 80 millimeters of mercury is higher than the ventricular area, this aortic valve remains closed in the first one. Okay, let's go back to the second one. So the first thing we're going to note is that the aortic valve is going to remain closed. Why? Because the pressure in the ventricle is still low. So aortic valve will remain closed. We don't have enough pressure, because remember, the pressure in the ventricle has to be increased more than 80 millimeters of mercury for this valve to open. All right, so the first one, aortic valve remains closed. Second to this, the contraction will cause an increase. Okay, so it will increase and the pressure will surpass. Okay, pressure will surpass that of the atrium. All right, so it will go above 8 millimeters of mercury, or whatever pressure it had been raised to because of contraction. So when this happens, when the ventricular pressure is more than the atrial pressure, what's going to happen? We're going to have the mitral valve closed. I'm sorry for that. We're going to have the mitral valve closed. So because the mitral valve is closing, okay, so what we have is this arrangement. I'll talk about more about the mitral valve closing at this point, but for now I just want to say the mitral valve has closed. Okay, so because it is beating, or the ventricle is beating now against two closed valves, we say that it is beating against the same volume. All right, so it is contracting with the same volume. So because it is contracting with the same volume, and why is the volume the same? Because it raised up enough pressure to close the mitral valve, that the pressure that was raised in the ventricle was not yet strong enough to sort of open the aortic valve. So the aortic valve is closed, mitral valve is closed, so you find that it is working against these two valves that are closed. So that is why we call it isovolumetric. It's one volume. And what is happening in this one volume arrangement? There is ventricular contraction. So that is phase 2. Another thing that we should note is, as the valve closes, all right, I told you I'd come back to the valve closing. So as the valve closes, we notice that it closes into the atrium, right? It sort of makes a bulge into the atrium, and this bulge into the atrium makes a slight rise in the atrial pressure, and so from the A wave we have another wave that is known as the C wave, because of the bulging in. And why is it bulging in? Because the mitral valve has just closed. And why is it closing? Because the ventricular pressure has now risen enough to close the mitral valve. All right, so it actually does make a sound as it closes, and this sound is known as S1. As the mitral valve closes, it makes the first heart sound, and this heart sound is known as S1. So again, let us just go through what is happening here. So at this point, we see that the ventricle is contracting with both of the valves closed. All right, and at this point we see that the pressure has exceeded. All right, pressure is more than 8 millimeters of mercury, and that is why we have the valve closing, but it is not yet more than 80. All right, so at this point it is more than 8, but it is not yet more than the 80 that is in the aorta, so it cannot yet open the aortic valve. That is what is happening here. All right. So from this point, we are now going to go into the next phase. So we can call this the early phase of ventricular contraction. Okay, so ventricular contraction can also be called systole. All right, so systole is equivalent to contraction, so ventricular contraction. So when you hear me say ventricular systole, I'm simply talking about ventricular contraction. All right, so that is what is going on in this second phase. Let me see if there's anything else that I would like to say. Oh yeah, so what is happening to the atrium? So at this point, the atrium is also receiving blood from the lungs. All right, so we have blood coming in from the lungs. All right, and so it is acting as a reservoir because it's closed, okay, and it's steadily filling up. So what else? So one, aortic valve is still closed. Two, the volume is the same because the mitral valve has closed. We also have S1 happening. Finally, I want us to also note that the atrium, okay, is acting as a reservoir. And why is it acting as a reservoir? I hope that's correct spelling. It's because it is still receiving. I think reservoir is like that. Reservoir. Oh my. One of the two should be correct. But it is still receiving blood from the lungs. All right. And so because it is receiving blood from the lungs, it is just acting as this container, which is known as a reservoir. Okay. So let's go to the next component. What is phase 3? So in phase 3, we are going to see a rapid ejection phase. All right. So what is going to happen in the rapid ejection phase? Just give me a few minutes. So we can write that down and say rapid ejection phase. So in rapid ejection phase, these are the events that occur. First of all, let's write that down. That's rapid ejection phase. So what are you expecting in this one? So we see that so this was at 0. Then that's millimeters of mercury. Then it went to 8. So at 8, we saw the valve closing, the mitral valve. Then it keeps on increasing. So as soon as the pressure increases to exceed, it goes above 80 millimeters of mercury. This is now the part that we want to talk about. So as soon as it goes beyond 80 millimeters of mercury, what you're going to see is that the aortic valve will now open because the pressure in the ventricle is now more than the pressure in the aorta. But because the pressure in the ventricle is still more than that in the atrium, the mitral valve will remain closed. So we are going to now open our aortic valve. All right. So because we have opened our aortic valve, remember that all this time we had pressure that was building up. All right. So there was a build-up of pressure because of the isovolumetric contraction. And then this build-up of pressure went above 80. Once it went above 80 millimeters of mercury, we saw that the aortic valve opened. Now, the opening of the aortic valve will result in ejection of blood. So, ejection of blood into the aorta from the ventricle. All right. So, the first one, because of the mount up of pressure, it will be sort of a rapid ejection. It will go out rapidly. All right, because of the pressure that was building up. And we've also noted that the ventricle will keep on contracting. All right, so the ventricle keeps contracting. And then there will be continued pumping of blood. So let's start again. It came from 0 at rest, went to 8, managed to close the mitral valve, but the aortic valve was still closed. So it kept on contracting and went all the way up to 80. Immediately it went above 80. The aortic valve opened, but then we had ejection of blood. It continued contracting, and this continued contraction then causes it to keep taking blood into the aorta. One thing you should learn about the aorta is that it is highly elastic, so it accommodates a lot of blood. It's compliant. A lot of blood can be taken into it, and it will be able to comply to sort of stretch out to accommodate the blood. So what is happening at this point to the atria? So at this point, the atria is still behaving as a reservoir, all right? And what is happening in the aorta? So I said the aorta is elastic and it will distend. And why is it distending? To accommodate, all right? To accommodate the blood that is being pushed into it. Maybe the other thing that I would like you to acknowledge is that the pressure that will be attained because of the contraction of the ventricle, how high will it go? Because I just kept on saying that it will be more than 80. So how high will it go? So it can actually attain about 120 millimeters of mercury. And this is because of ventricular contraction. So remember, I said I can also call it ventricular systole. So because of ventricular systole, you find that the pressure in the ventricle will go all the way up to 120, and this because now they're almost acting, the aorta and the ventricles are almost acting as one chamber. The pressure will actually be translated into the aorta. So you find that when the ventricle is in systole, it's going to translate the 120 into the aorta. So that's pressure that you will find in the aorta when the heart is contracting or when the heart is in systole. The other word that I'd like you to know is when the heart is at rest, we call that diastole. So most of the time when you look at blood pressures, you will see systole over diastole. So that is why you're going to see the 120 over, initially when it was at rest, that was 80. So it's good to have that in mind. So remember, it's still acting as a reservoir, and I think at this point we also have a third wave that we see as it is acting as a reservoir, because there's now increase in blood, okay, keeps on receiving, so there's slight increase in pressure because now there's just a lot of blood coming in or an increased